All right, so the next function that we are going to look at is the transfer function. So as the name suggests, the transfer function is essentially you transferring, you calling this function or somebody calling this function to transfer the tokens from one account to the other. So essentially, initially the tokens are with you. And you call the transfer function and you give the tokens to other people. So you won't hold the tokens, you won't keep them with yourself, right? So you would want to distribute your tokens. And that's tokenomics. That's another separate series that you can see on my channel. But for now, the transfer function essentially allows the person to transfer token to a recipient. So two things we need in the transfer function. One is the to whom we are transferring, which is what you can see over here, the recipient, and the amount of tokens that we are transferring. So the transfer function essentially needs these two parameters to be passed to it for it to successfully execute. And it returns us a bools, right? So once this transfer function is successfully executed, it returns us a true or a false. Now, as per the ERC20 standard, we also need to implement and we also need to emit an event inside this transfer function. We'll see how we do that shortly. And this event essentially creates a log of the activity that happened inside this function. So with all of that, let's jump straight into our transfer function and see how we can transfer value to tokens to the recipient. So the first thing that I'm going to do is inside the transfer function, I'm going to check that the amount that is being sent to the transfer function is greater than 0. For that, I'm simply going to use require, and I'm going to type inside require that amount that's been passed. So essentially it's this. So I'll just copy paste it from here. And this amount should be greater than 0. And if this amount is not greater than 0, if it's anything less than 0, then there should be some error that should go back and the transaction should be reversed. And that error should be that amount must be greater than 0. So that's the first thing I'm going to check. I don't want to transfer 0 amount to anyone. The next thing that I'm going to check is the person who is sending the message.sender, which is essentially myself. That person has an amount which is greater than 0. So how I'm going to do that is I'm simply going to write another require statement. And inside this require statement, I'm simply going to call the balances mapping. So I have my balances mapping over here. So I'm simply going to copy my balances. And I'm simply going to check that the balance of the person who is sending this amount, which is the message.sender, the person who's calling this function, right? So the person who's calling this transfer function, the address of that person would be in message.sender. And initially when I deployed the contract, message.sender has the address of the founder, which is the person who deployed the contract. But subsequently, whoever calls this transfer function, and again, I've covered off these details in the bootcamp series, but subsequent transfers to this function, the address of those people who will call this transfer function would be in the message.sender, right? So message.sender again would be greater than amount. So I need to check that the person who is transferring his amount should be greater than what he's actually transferring. Otherwise, he doesn't have sufficient balance inside his account. So balance must be greater than 0. So these two checks essentially help me to make sure that the amount that I'm sending is not a 0 amount. And the person who called this transfer function, the person who's sending, he has amount greater than or equal to the amount that he's sending. Now I will start with the actual transfer. So to transfer the tokens, I will decrement the tokens first. So since the person who's sending it, I will have to decrement his account. So I'm simply going to update the mapping and decrement his account and say that balances of the person who is sending sender, decrement this by the amount. So I will copy this again. So it's a simple subtraction statement minus amount. And I can also write this more smartly. I can just remove, and this will work perfectly all right, but just to just for a better coding practice, I can simply write minus equal to. It's the same thing as what I just wrote. I'll just put that in comments. All right, so what I'm doing over here is that I'm subtracting the balance from the message.sender. So I'm subtracting the amount from the balances of the message.sender. And who am I giving the amount to? The person who's receiving it, right? So the balances of the recipient and the recipient address over here. So I'll say the balances of the recipient, and just like how I did minus equal to, I will simply do plus equal to and amount. Control C. And I'll make the correction over here as well. Minus equal to. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to emit the transfer event. So I will call the transfer event. So let's just quickly copy it from here only and avoid a typo. So I will copy the transfer event from here, and I'm going to emit the transfer event. And the transfer event requires me to pass three things, right? So it requires me to pass the address of the person message.sender from address, and then the one that I'm transferring to and the amount that I'm transferring to. So I will simply type the following over here. So my from is the message.sender and my to is the recipient. So I'll copy the recipient, and my amount is my amount. So I'll copy the amount. And that should be it for this function. Okay, I realize that this function, the ERC20 standard, also requires me to return a bool. So I will simply type return true. And that should work well. So I'm simply going to just quickly check if there are any errors, and there aren't any errors reported. So yep, that is all. That is the implementation of my transfer function. So a quick recap, I simply first check that the amount that's been transferred and passed to this function by the caller of the function is greater than 0. And then whoever called this function, the message.sender, his amount is greater than the amount that's being transferred, and he has the allowance to transfer it. The next thing that I'm going to check if the balances, so once I check these two, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start the transfer function, and the transfer function starts between these two lines, decrement the amount of the person who's sending it, and then add the amount to the recipient. Once these two are successfully done, I'll simply emit the transfer event, which is what the ERC20 contract requires me to do, and I'll simply return true, which is what the standard requires me also to do, to return a Boolean true. And that is all for the transfer function. And I hope you understand that. And next, let's start looking at the allowance function.